As Java developers, we work with a lot of legacy code, don't we? A lot of old code written in Java, not like the cool kids who write Python who always deal with new code, right? Even though Python is older than Java. So anyway, this is an interesting article that says the most important tool for working with legacy code is empathy. Every software developer who has spent more than a few weeks on a project has at least one experience in common. You find yourself reading through a file, scratching your head, trying to figure out what the author was thinking. This usually happens in legacy code where you're reading code that was written many years ago by some developer who's no longer working in the company. When you finally get to that aha moment, it can come with feelings ranging from confusion and frustration to awe and respect and so on. Have you folks had this? How many folks deal with legacy code? Let me know in the chat. I'm curious. However, there's one skill I try to practice in these situations: empathy. This is especially true when working with legacy code. I thought I'd discuss what I keep in mind when working with legacy applications and how they help me understand why these projects are the way they are and empathize with the author. The thing is, when I was new in the industry, all right, I used to make this mistake. I used to feel like I could do better. Okay, I would look at code that was written ages ago, and I mean, like, okay, if only we could just scrap this all away and start from the scratch, it would be so much better. We wouldn't have to deal with all that mess, right? We have a clean start. We know now what we need. So those idiots wrote bad code. Let's not make that same mistake again. Let's write good code this time, right? But what I've realized is that even code written with the best of intentions become bad over time, right? It's basically any code that endures a few changes, a few developers coming and making some small changes and going away, a few projects that are delayed because of some external pressure and the poor developer has to rush through the code, do what it takes to get things done, make trade-offs and all that stuff. And those trade-offs, those things that they give up, stay in the code longer. And, a developer comes over like me and then judges them harshly. It's like, no, that's not the way it is, right? The reality is that whatever you do ideally in a fresh, clean slate environment is not going to sustain, right? Real world is a little more complex. You're going to end up with problems. So I guess that's what empathy is. Kind of empathize from their point of view and say, well, this is not quite ideal, but understand. Software developers are smart. I don't know if I agree with this statement. Some are smart, not all are smart. There have been times when I wasn't very smart. So I guess it depends. First, it's best to operate under the assumption that the code's author was at least as smart and competent as you are. But that doesn't mean that they're smart. That assumes that I'm smart to begin with. This one should go without saying, but it's the bare minimum requirement for the rest of these practices. If you worked alongside other developers and studied computer science, you should be well aware that this industry is saturated with brilliant people. I don't think I entirely agree with this assessment. There are a lot of brilliant people, yes, but then there are a lot of people who have no idea what they're doing as well. I've met both kinds. So you cannot automatically assume that they're smart, but you can assume that they had good intentions. I think that's a fair thing to assume. They weren't intentionally trying to break anything. They had good intentions. They worked with the best of their abilities. It's also safe to assume that there were challenges that they were trying to overcome. So I think that kind of empathy I can have, assuming they're smart and everything that they did was the right decision, is probably not always accurate. To take a project from idea to implementation alone is no small feat. Navigating an ever-changing landscape of technologies and system architectures, balancing stakeholder priorities, and getting a working product out the door can be a monumental task, which is fair. The original developers managed that and built something that has survived for 5 or even 10 years. So I think it's safe to assume that they at least had some idea of what they were doing. Okay, they may not have an idea of what they were doing, but people over time have made it work. So again, not to assume that they were absolutely right and spot on, but it was a team effort. It's still working. It brings me to the next thing I try to keep in mind, that this code is still live in production. It's a testament to how well it's doing its job. At the end of the day, we're not writing code to publish and admire for its beauty. We're trying to solve a problem. Any developer would be proud of building a project that could stand the test of time, especially in an industry as fluid as this one. Yes, that is true. You write code so that it runs in production, but you also write code so that it can be managed, maintained, and it can continue to run in production. If what you've written is basically patchwork and duct tape and it's somehow working in production, but don't touch it, if you make any change, it'll break, I don't think that's quite what a developer should be doing. Your goal isn't to have something that runs in production. Your goal is to have something that can be maintained, can be read and understood, and can be enhanced so that it can continue to work in production. So yes, it's good that it's still working, but it's not the be all and end all of what software should be, right? You weren't there. It brings me to what I think is the most important thing I need to remind myself when working on legacy application. Whoever worked on this in the past made the best decision they could with the information they had at the time. This I agree with. Yes, they might have made the best decision with the best of intentions. Doesn't mean that it's still the best decision and the best of intentions. It still may not be the best decision now, but that's the empathy. See, that's the empathy that I agree with. They did what they could at the time, even though it may not be right at this time. This is true for a lot of legacy code. A lot of bad decisions, we look at code and go like, why did it do this? Well, at the time, it was the right decision. So that's the empathy that I definitely agree with, and that's what we should have when we are looking at code. When working on a project, we're often faced with decisions that we have no right answers. We have to make a decision based on what might happen in the future. Maybe it's the direction that the business will shift, or the availability of talented developers in a tech stack, or it could even relate it to the expected lifetime of a third-party package we are going to use. It could even be the lifetime of the tech stack, right? You might go like, okay, you choose the latest technology right now, and 5 years down the line, they're going to be like, oh, why did you use this? This happens quite a lot. So even now, I see people write to me and say, hey, can you make Struts 2 tutorials, right? The last Struts 2 tutorial I made was, I think, 8 years ago. It was a very long time back, okay? And people still watch it. People are still using Struts 2 today. And guess what? When they chose it, that was an awesome decision, right? When Struts 2 was just being released, people were like, Struts 1 is bad, man. Don't use it. Use Struts 2. It's the new shiny thing. This is going to solve all of the problems. And when it was released, it did solve all the problems that Struts 1 had, right? I don't even remember what Struts 2 does now, but those tutorials are there and people still watch it. And this is an indication that it is being used. It is actively being used. So my point is, decisions that were made at the time were right at the time. So I guess that's what is the key to empathy here. Tech stacks get outdated. You might choose the best tech stacks right now, and soon someone else is going to come and go like, wow, who's this guy who chose this? It's bad. All right? Should be obvious. The best decision, they made the best decision with the information they had at the time. All right. What can we do now? So we've decided the previous developers of a project were smart and talented. No, I didn't decide that, you did, but it's fair. The code is still being used today, yes, and the developers made the best decision they could at the time. That's the one I agree with. It's clear that whoever worked on the project shared long-term thinking, assumed they made choices for a reason, which is obvious. There can be a lot of confusing code in the code base, and you have to ask yourself why. This is also something that I agree with. Oftentimes, when we look at code and we go like, this is crazy that it exists, there's a reason behind it, and when you change it, it's only then that you know why that thing existed in the first place, because that thing is going to break. So I think it's going to be presumptuous to assume that you can do a better job by cleaning everything up and doing things from the scratch, because again, you're going to go through the same process and the same reality is going to hit your code once it gets through a certain age. So it's good to remember that. Might not agree with all of these points, but I do in general agree that this is an empathy that you need to have.